But thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Kyle Kubler, who's part of the McGill Writing Centre. The McGill Writing Centre, and Dr. Kubler can speak more to it, but it's a free service for students at McGill who want to improve their writing or who need some like additional tutoring and guidance when it comes to their writing. So this is a very um, special kind of collaboration and the first time that MSWI has collaborated with the McGill Writing Center. And today our workshop will really focus on writing and how to structure your writing. So maybe I'll let Kyle, you can take it from here.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And thanks to the MSWI for having me here today. I'm hoping this is the beginning of future collaborations because I think, particularly in the courses that I teach and some of the services that the Writing Center offers more broadly, there's clearly a lot of overlap between both of our goals. So yeah, thanks for having me today. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can just kind of hop into it. All right. Okay, great. So it's just to give a little bit of a broader overview of what we do at the Writing Center. We offer writing focused courses for undergrads and graduate students. Um, we have a tutoring service. So this as part of your tuition, you're already paying for 7 hours of one-on-one tutoring through the Writing Center. This renews every term, so fall, winter, and summer. And this can be used for any type of writing assignment, sort of at any stage of the process. So we highly recommend that you check out those services. We also just started a new like oral presentation tutoring service as well. So if you would like help practicing for a presentation, or you're maybe giving a conference talk or something like that, we also offer services that can support you there. At the graduate student level, we also have several writing workshops and writing support groups. So we have one that's called like 3 months to advance your thesis for those graduate students that are sort of at the end stage of their program. And we also have some sort of like thesis writing labs, which are a little bit more informal, where you can just it's sort of like an accountability practice where you can just go to a particular space that's organized by one of our staff members and then you basically just have a time to write and kind of be held accountable to that process. Um, if you'd like to learn more about the McGill Writing Center, we have our website, which is just mcgill.ca/MWC. But we also are on Instagram now. So if you'd like to follow us and get updates about what we do through social media, we have that option as well. Um, for myself, I'm one of the faculty lecturers in the Writing Center. You can see here on the screen some of the courses that I teach. And so I'll mostly be talking about this in the context of science communication. And I will just give like a quick plug for if you are graduate students and you're interested in taking a science communication course, this WCOM 627 Science Communication for the Digital Public is a course that I will be teaching this coming winter, and there are still spots available for that. So if that's something that's interesting to you, feel free to sign up for that, or if you have questions about it, I'm happy to take those at the end of this little presentation. Um, let's see.
Just so everyone knows, I've also linked the Instagram and the website in our chat. So those are accessible for anybody that's curious.
Great. Um, this is also one of our sort of an example of a graduate workshop that we hold. We hold several of them throughout the term. The one that we have upcoming next is called Smart Sentences and Strategies for Writing with Style. So that's going to be on Friday, November 15th. We usually do about one graduate writing workshop a month, and they're free to sign up for students of McGill. And you can find notifications and information about this stuff both on our website and on social media. Um, cool. So I'm going to go over sort of three, well, I guess two main aspects of some of the content that I teach in my writing courses, and some of this content is taught a little broadly throughout several McGill Writing Center classes. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Um, I think the goal with this for me is not only to share some practical tips, but also sort of give you a little preview of the type of work that we would do in our classes or in some of our workshops, to give you an idea, just to, if this is something that you're interested in and wanting to develop a little bit more in your own writing, to know that we have this information and this type of information available at a little bit more of a more in-depth level. Because given the constraints of just of a short workshop, we'll be covering quite a lot fairly quickly. But if you have questions along the way, maybe put them in the chat or use like the raise hand icon emoji thing, so I'll see it pop up on my screen. But there'll also be time at the end for those if you'd like to ask questions at the end. So we'll start with APOS, which is an acronym that stands for Audience, Purpose, Organization, and Style. These are some of the sort of the APOS heuristic covers these four components of writing that we like to think about and introduce our students to right when we begin thinking about a particular writing assignment or a goal. So we'll kind of go through each of these together. But as a general overview, the question of audience really pertains to who I want to talk to, what their interest is, what they already know, and sort of what's the context of my communication with them. So why am I trying to talk to this particular audience? Why do I think they need to know what I have to say? Who are they? And what is it about who they are that I can use to shape my message in a certain way that's going to be the most appropriate, the most maybe convincing. So these are some of those sort of components that we would consider with audience. As we sort of go through these, one of the things you'll notice is that all of these categories are linked. So purpose and audience are connected. Purpose and organization are connected. Organization and style, style and audience. It's kind of hard to really, we can talk about them as separate categories, but what we're going to find is in practice, they all have some type of internal relationship to each other, in the sense that if we pick a particular stylistic approach that we want to use in our writing, that's going to have consequences, both positive and negative, for organization, purpose, and audience. Same with our audience, for example. We might pick a certain audience, and that's going to sort of shape how we understand purpose, organization, and style, right? If we want to write like a science textbook for children of the ages of between 6 and 10, that's going to largely shape the type of language we use, how we organize our thought, how we sort of put together this book, and et cetera, et cetera. So these are sort of where we start and the kind of the components that are going to matter the most for us going forward. We'll talk about different ways to organize our piece later, but I think we can sort of see here on the screen some of the different components of each of these categories. So one of the subcomponents of audience that I think is worth touching on here is the difference between evoked audience and an addressed audience. So the evoked audience is the audience that the author wants to speak to. So when you are writing that science book for children, the audience that you are evoking, you might even say on the book, as they often do with like young adult and children's books, is they say this book is appropriate for ages or grade level or reading level. They have some way to break it down by audience, but your evoked audience might be 6 to 10-year-old children. And that may or may not align with the addressed audience. The addressed audience are the people that actually end up reading the thing that you've written. And to the best of our ability, what we try to do as authors is get these two circles to overlap as much as possible. We want the people we want to speak to actually be the ones reading our work, but we only have so much control over this. So in certain cases, we might not be able to totally control who reads our work. But there are certain ways that we can do it, such as picking an appropriate outlet, and doing things like having a label that says, we want kids from 6 to 10 years old to read this. This could also just be, um, you know, this could be determined also by where we publish our piece in. We do all of these different things to try and address our evoked audience, but we know that in certain cases, they're not going to overlap. There's only so much we can do about it. Um, if you've ever sort of read, whether it's science writing or anything else, if you've read maybe a book or an article and the text starts off really hard and difficult. You don't really know a lot of the vocabulary words. You feel like you're entering into a room where a conversation's sort of already been happening and you're just kind of like left out. Like you didn't like you're like coming in at the middle of a movie and you didn't see the beginning, or you're in the middle of a joke and you didn't get you missed the punchline. Those feelings of writing something that we feel like just isn't written for us, that's an instance of where you are not the evoked audience. You're the addressed audience because you're reading it, but you're not who the author had in mind when they wrote the piece. And this feeling can be quite alienating and discouraging. And recognizing that, it sort of underlines the importance of doing the best that we can to make sure that who we want to read this actually is reading this. So um, I mentioned outlets earlier. We can learn things about the outlets that we've written to and written for so that they can best align with the audience that we want. If we were to use the MSWI as an example here, um, oftentimes different publications or outlets will have an about page that will give you an idea of who they are for. If you're writing for an academic press or you're writing for an academic peer-reviewed journal, it's likely the case that your audience is other academics. In the case of MSWI, we know that the McGill Scientific Writing Initiative aims to help students navigate the intricacies of scientific texts in order to effectively convey scientific material to a variety of audiences. So already we know that the audience for the MSWI is going to be other students. Maybe not necessarily McGill students, but if I had to guess, I'd say there's probably a primary focus on other McGill students and then sort of a secondary emphasis on students outside of the sort of the McGill campus. So we can take sort of cues from our outlets to identify who this audience is and use that to have sort of to help shape our decisions about the purpose of our piece, the way that we organize that piece, and the kind of stylistic devices that we use. So if we sort of move from audience to purpose, we'll notice a few different things. So the first is that audience and purpose are linked. What this means is that oftentimes we want to get a message across, and that message is only going to be appropriate for certain audiences, right? We might want to, for example, talk about the sort of the historic failures or past failures of like carbon capture and sequestration technology. That might be really important to us, but that's not going to be particularly important to the 6 to 10-year-old that you're writing this science communication for like children book for, right? You have a purpose, but that's not appropriate for the audience. It doesn't mean that you can't talk about climate change. It doesn't mean that you can't talk about carbon dioxide to a 6 to 10-year-old age range. But you might not want to go into all of the details and various technologies that people have tried to use to try and capture carbon, or actually just carbon exhaust, or actually just sort of like put it in the ground, for example. Oftentimes students will ask whether you can have more than one audience or purpose. And the answer is yes, but it comes with a little bit of it comes at your own peril in a certain sense, which is that the more audiences and the more purposes you have, the harder it is to find an appropriate organizational and stylistic structure that meets those demands. If your audiences are really diverse and you wanted to target, for example, 6 to 10-year-olds and environmental scientists, that's going to be a really hard task that you're setting yourself up with, because you're going to have to find some type of organizational and structural model and language model that's going to work for those two really divergent audiences. So that's going to be a little tough. Um, but for example, there are certainly ways that if you are writing this children's scientific book, that you could somehow speak to parents, for example. This is something that we see very often in like Disney or Pixar movies, is that they're sort of made for kids, but the writers are always sort of like sneaking in these jokes or certain things that are going to be kind of that are always they're gonna catch the attention of the parents as well. Um, Things that for the kids they kind of go over their head, they don't really get it, but it's funny for the parents. And then obviously vice versa. There's most of the stuff is oriented toward the kids. With the parents, they could kind of care less. So yes, we can have different audiences and purposes. Um, One of the ways that this kind of works out, I think, in a lot of science writing is that you have an outlet that is really popular among a broad variety of readers. So if we want to take the example of science communication, we might take something like Nature's magazine or like the blog, like Nature has a blog, and they also have like a popular press magazine along with being a peer-reviewed academic journal. Um, so that outlet might be open to a wide range of people that are just generally interested in scientific topics. But you might have this particular subject of carbon capture and sequestration. I'm just going to go with these same examples probably throughout the entire presentation. Um, so you have a difference between your outlet and your subject. You might attract certain people that are really into CCS technologies, and you're also going to attract just general science readers. So your audiences are going to be a little different, and you can kind of work to match those. Um, Lastly, for the sort of the linking between audience and purpose, you want to be able to ask two simple questions. And they always sound somewhat crude when I sort of talk about them to my students when I'm reviewing a lot of their work. But a lot of my inline comments will look like, "So what?" and "Who cares?" And so what I mean by this is that the in order to sort of achieve or to know that you're sort of fulfilling the requirement of having a clear purpose in your piece, you want to be able to answer this question of like, so what, right? You've said something, you think it matters, but it needs to be clear not only to you, but to your audience that there's actually something worth reading here. Um, and and again, I think it can sound sort of abrasive, and it's not the case that I think that a lot of people are writing about things that don't matter. I think that most people write things about things that matter, but they have a hard time demonstrating exactly why that is, why someone other than them should care. Where often the things that we tend to write about outside of like a school assignment are generally things that we're really passionate about, things that we care about, and things that we want other people to know about. But we have to, there's sort of the downsides of our own passion is that we often have a difficult time explaining why those things matter for other people because we just inherently assume that they're interesting or that people care about them because we're passionate about them. But we have to recognize that most people aren't that interested inherently in the thing that you really care about. So your job is to make them interested. It's not that people can't be interested in your thing. It's just that it's not going to be self-evident. You can't assume that people will already be interested in it. So if we can clearly denote the sort of the consequences of our articles and our arguments, and we can clarify who cares about this type of thing or who should care, then we're going to set ourselves up really nicely for having a nice linking between audience and purpose, and we're probably going to have a pretty strong article. All right, so I want to move on to thinking about structure a little bit. So here we have sort of a traditional storytelling narrative structure. And it's possible that if you've taken writing classes in the past, whether that's creative writing, fiction writing, or nonfiction writing, you've maybe seen a graph or like a chart that kind of looks something like this. This is the sort of traditional narrative structure where you have um, the beginning of your piece is quite calm. It's a slow build. You're sort of explaining the environment, you're setting the scene, and you're slowly moving into some level of conflict. There's rising action. There's like a climax, right? The sort of the thing that happens that's exciting. and then you get this kind of falling action and resolution. So the engagement of your reader traditionally is that you sort of build, you do a slow build where you're bringing in your reader's attention and interest slowly until it peaks at a certain moment and then kind of resolves itself. This is a tried and true narrative structure. It works very well for books. It works very well for movies. It works very well for um, like seasons of TV shows. But one of the things that it doesn't always work super well for is short form writing pieces that are largely published online. And the reason for this is that when we were online and trying to read shorter pieces, um, we are focusing on an audience that has not necessarily a limited attention span, but attention span that is being challenged for other sort of there's other distractions around um, that you need to sort of keep people's attention in ways that the sort of traditional narrative structure doesn't lend itself to do as well. So if you know that your audience is reading your piece online, you might need to shift that narrative structure a little bit. So I sort of offer a sort of a modulated or a reversed narrative structure for my students, which looks something like this here. So rather than starting with a slow build, we can often do something where we can sort of set our scene and create a strong and exciting hook. Um, a hook is kind of like your first paragraph that is going to draw your reader in with something interesting. A lot of times, your hook is actually something that's kind of purposely confusing. That feeling of being of like entering a conversation in the middle and not really knowing um, what is being said. That feeling, when it's just the first paragraph or the sort of the intro portion of your piece, can actually be sort of counterintuitively quite intriguing because it can sort of pull your reader in to say, "Hey, what's going on here? Can I make sense of this?" Now, if you don't quickly help your reader make sense of what's going on, you're going to lose them. But for a moment, it can help pull them in to want to actually read more, which is why the next step is clarifying why what you're talking about is important. So you start with something big and flashy to grab people and bring them in. From there, you sort of explain what's important about what you're talking about. You provide your main argument with your evidence somewhere in the middle. This is, sort of the most boring part of the piece is probably somewhere in the middle. But the way that you get them reading to the end is that you move into this section here that I've labeled as like the way that your argument connects to the importance. So what's really important about this last piece about how your piece can connect to your conclusion is that successful writers will make their readers feel smart. They make them feel really good about themselves, like they've learned something by reading your piece. So what you want to do here is, if you can, is you've explained why something is important at the beginning of your piece, but you haven't really demonstrated the evidence for it. You haven't made your claim or your argument yet. So at this point, all we're doing is taking our author's word for it, but we haven't had the evidence. After we make it through the evidence, what we can do at the end here is demonstrate how our reader now knows something about a subject that other people don't know and that they didn't know before they got over here. If we can demonstrate how our evidence is required to better understand a subject in a way we didn't understand it before in the past, our readers come away feeling like, I've understood something at a new level of complexity that I didn't before. That makes me feel really good. And through the transitive property, I like this author and I want to read more of their stuff. So this kind of like peak and valley approach can sometimes be a little bit more appropriate for shorter form online writing work. And you'll see this in science writing all the time. Oftentimes, the first paragraph of a science article that you'll read will talk about some new study or some new drug or some brand new therapy for something, right? And what most good science writers do is they don't just blatantly hype up this new technologies or this new discovery or a new research paper as like changing the world or changing the field in which it's situated, but they say something like, okay, this is a brand new study. It's super exciting. Now let's get into the details. What does this really mean? What can we really take away from this? How do we really understand this field and some of the changes that are happening in it, right? So it kind of, you kind of like blast off into space for a little bit and you get brought down into reality. As you get brought down, toward the end, you have to come back up a little bit in a way where you say, look, now that we've understand and now that we've sort of made this argument for how we can better understand this industry or this field or whatever, or this discovery, look at all these tools we have for understanding the world better. You're sort of giving, you want to give your audience a gift in a certain sense. When it comes to narrative structure, I usually tell my students that it's not always worth it to kind of reinvent the wheel. I think a lot of, at least when I was younger in undergrad and I was writing myself, I sort of had this feeling like if I want to be a good writer, I have to do something innovative, or I have to make some change that no one's made before. And that's like typical of what someone might think in undergrad. Like you think that you are the one that's going to like completely change these structures that are sort of pretty solid in the way that we write or in society or whatever. And I just want to stress that you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Like I think following these structures, when you understand this type of narrative structure for science writing, you're going to see it over and over and over again. And it's totally fine to replicate those same narrative structures that you see in good science writing and just change the content based on whatever you're looking for. You do need to make sure that your organizational structure is appropriate and fits with your purpose and your audience, but you don't need to go in search of like some brand new narrative structure. Um, the sort of the often what I'll say is if we want to think about this like a murder mystery or something. If we've ever read a murder mystery or watched murder mysteries on TV or in movies, they pretty much always follow the exact same narrative structure. Like you know at a certain point when the who done it or who killed who is going to be revealed, and you know the sort of setup of the potential suspects, and all of this sort of structure feels pretty familiar. But it doesn't stop us from watching it because it feels familiar. There's something that we like about the familiarity because we still don't know who did it until the very end. So the sort of the similarities or replication of that structure doesn't necessarily take away from what we like with that genre. And the same is true for science writing. Okay, so we've sort of covered the audience purpose, organization. We're gonna move on to style here a little bit, and then we can sort of take some questions after that. So here we have one of my favorite stylistic devices, which is cinematic distance, which broadly speaking asks the question about how close to the action are you? When you are writing different scenes in science writing, um, you have the ability to essentially zoom in and zoom out, paint a really close picture of something that's happening versus offering a sort of broad analysis or overview of something. So here on the screen, we've got a scene from The Bear, which is this a show that at least season one primarily takes place not just in Chicago, not just in a restaurant, but in the back of a restaurant, right? The entire first season is in the back of this kitchen, and it's very stressful. It's very tight quarters. And the ability of the show to describe life with that level of closeness and intimacy and sort of roughness is one of the things that the show does really, really well. It's super zoomed in. The cinematic distance is super zoomed in. The flip side is you have a show like Planet Earth, which is going to zoom way out and take this literally planetary view of these different life forms on Earth. So good writers whether this is science writing or just honestly any kind of writing, are going to be able to modulate their cinematic distance. They're going to be able to zoom in on certain scenes and zoom out to make broader claims. The reason why we move between these two is because we can only certain levels of cinematic distance afford themselves different types of outcomes. So if we only stay zoomed in and we're like, let's say we're writing about a particularly like a new study that was done in a particular field, we can zoom in and we can describe the study, we can describe the different patients that were used or the experimental design. We can talk about all these different kinds of things at a quite zoomed in level. Um, but if we stay zoomed in, we're not going to be able to zoom out and talk about the broader picture. We're not going to be able to talk about what this study means in context. We're not going to be able to talk about are there other similar studies that have been done? What are the consequences of this study? Where do we think future research is going to go? All of these other important components to most science articles, we're not going to be able to do if we stay so zoomed in. If all we do is zoom out and we never get a chance to zoom in on any particular scenes, our writing is just kind of like mostly boring and surface level. We don't really give the audience an idea of what you're actually talking about. If you describe a study um, that involves like, maybe um, maybe you're trying to do like a study on like humans and blood lipids or something in medicine, and this requires the people running the study to like take blood samples from the patients. If you don't explain that and you don't go into the detail of sort of what that looks like, you might miss an opportunity to explain like concretely what's going on to your audience, but you might also miss an opportunity to like get your reader interested in it, to bring them to the lab where you have these technicians that are sort of extracting the blood of these patients to try and understand how their heart functions, right? All of a sudden you don't have this kind of like dry, boring explanation of a study, but you're bringing people into the sort of the study itself and getting people hooked in that sort of way. So this is one of the ways that I think that moving and zooming in and zooming out and moving between a close and a far cinematic distance can sort of be successful for us as writers. Um, so there are sort of three different stylistic devices here along with cinematic distance that I'll just touch on briefly. Jargon, which is one I think that we've heard before. We've probably heard different things about it. So we'll cover jargon, word choice, and then another one that's pretty helpful, which is sort of and maybe talked about a little less, which is like the head to tail transition. Um, so I'll just start with jargon here. I think the knee-jerk reaction, I think a lot of times in the sciences, if we're trying to communicate to either a broader scientific audience or a non-science specialist audience, is that jargon is somehow bad and should be avoided. Now, the first thing I'll say here is that jargon is relative. What I mean by that is that it is relative to your audience. And this is an example of how style and audience are linked. If you're speaking to a bunch of scientists in your field, what is and isn't jargon is a completely different question than if you are speaking to 6 to 10-year-olds, right? So the question of jargon is relative to the audience. All that jargon means is that if someone thinks a word is jargon, it means that they haven't heard it before and they're unfamiliar with it, and that it's maybe describing something technical. But we can have plenty of words that are specific and describe things that are technical that we're aware of, and we simply don't think of them as jargon because they're quite familiar to us. So when people label things as jargon, it's often a sign of them being unfamiliar. Jargon can also be quite helpful for us when we're writing because it reduces word count. If we have to describe over and over and over again a certain process rather than just using the name, which might be considered jargon, we're going to take up a lot of time. Our pieces are going to be a little bit boring. Jargon's really efficient. The flip side of that, of course, is that if you're using words that are considered jargon, you're not going to be as relatable to audiences that can't access that word. So you always have to think, who is my audience and what is my purpose? Um, in certain instances, for example, there might be like chemical processes or different types of procedures, scientific or medical procedures that you might need to be talking about. And it might be, in those cases, you essentially have two choices. You can either use the jargony term and describe it early on so that your readers are familiar with it. Or you can try and talk about the procedure or the process using plain language without using the actual concrete term and just describing it like that throughout the piece. Um, this is kind of up to you, but those decisions should be made based on how you think it's going to turn out best for your goals with the piece and who your audience is. So the next is word choice. This is sort of an example here on the board that you can refer to, excuse me, not on the board on our presentation. I was teaching just a few hours ago, so I'm in board mode. Um, so here, the question is how to pick like nice vocabulary words in a sort of a simple a simple way of saying it. Um, I think oftentimes students' reflexes are to say something like, well, I'm going to write my piece and it's going to be boring. And then I'm going to like go to the thesaurus or I'm going to ask ChatGPT to like give me a better word for this word. Or like I want to use the word like dig, but make it fancy. Or like I want to like I'm going to say the word, use the verb walk, but I want you to make it like sound cooler than walk. What's a cool way to say walk? This is kind of like the sort of, you're like, you get your ice cream and you're just like putting sprinkles on top at the end. You're just like sprinkling on style to our piece. I would recommend against this approach for a few reasons. The main one, though, is simply that oftentimes those fancy words or like the cool sounding words that we add in at the end don't have a very clear relationship between the thing we're writing about. They're not connected to our subject, they're not connected to our audience, and they're not connected to our purpose. So when we pick words, we need to pick the words that are actually fit well within all of these different variables, which makes writing difficult, right? Writing is not an easy process for this reason. And so the example here on the screen, I think, is a nice one for this because we have an author here, an environmental writer for the Los Angeles Times, who is trying to write about this concept called managed retreat. Now, we know what those words mean in and of themselves. To manage something and to retreat, we're all familiar with. But when you stick them together, managed retreat is an environmental science concept that means something very particular. And it doesn't necessarily just mean the addition of those two words. It means specifically how to retreat from coastline as sea levels rise and coastlines literally move and sort of get swallowed up by the ocean. So, or some other body of water. Um, and this was something that was difficult for our science writers because they were trying to figure out, okay, what can we do? How do we describe managed retreat in a way that engages people, but doesn't sound like, terrible, wonky inside baseball? So here's what they came up with. They did the thing where they introduce the term and then define it. So they define managed retreat as move back, relocate, and cede the land to nature. And then later, they start using some nice active verbs that are associated with this concept and what it's doing to these different coastal cities that are having to kind of navigate what to do with their, really fancy homes that are soon to be swallowed up, in this case, by the ocean. So the words managed retreat here have roiled the few cities bold enough to utter them. Mayors have been ousted, planning documents rewritten, campaigns waged over the very thought of turning prime real estate back into dunes and beaches. So here, these active verbs like to oust or to wage or words that are roiling cities, right? All of these sort of they connotate some type of conflict, right? They connotate um, like for a mayor to be ousted. If we think about what ousted means, like I don't know about for you, but for me, It's like I imagine there's like a bouncer at a bar that like grab like cartoon style. They like grab someone by the back of their shirt and they like throw them out of the bar, right? That's like you're ousting someone. Now these mayors, no one is throwing them out of any rooms, right? But the idea that a mayor could be ousted because they've suggested that managed retreat is the way to go, right? All of a sudden we have this very conflictual image in our head. Um, Campaigns being waged, right? There are people that are, the things that we often wage in the verb sense is like war, right? We're associated with hearing the phrase waging war. So if we're thinking about waging, if we say that these campaigns are being waged, rather than like, oh, the campaign was run, or campaigns have been created, or campaigns have been started, boring, right? If we're waging a campaign, that's like warlike, which also speaks to the sort of intensity of what's going on here. So all of these verbs are chosen not just randomly out of a thesaurus, but they're chosen because they actively reflect the type of scene that our writer is trying to create. And they sort of accurately reflect what's going on in this piece, which is that our author wants to tell the reader that the concept of managed retreat is really contentious and that people don't want to admit that they are going to have to let go of some of this pristine coastline where all of their multi-million-dollar homes are, right? So there's a lot we can do with this. The other thing that's really nice about this example is how concise it is, right? We're just using one word here, saying mayors have, left office, changing left office into ousted. It does a lot with just one word. And this is going to save you space so that you can develop other aspects of your piece. So lastly, I'll just point you to another sort of style device that I like quite a bit, which is the sort of the head to tail transition. Oftentimes we struggle with how to transition from one section to another. And because we need transitions, we need multiple paragraphs in our piece. But with every transition, we also risk sort of losing our audience. So one of the ways that we can transition effectively while keeping our audience is the head to tail transition. So what it looks like here is when you basically take a word from the ending of one paragraph and then immediately start the next paragraph with the same word in that first sentence. So an example here, this is talking about space exploration. The person's their last name is Green here. So Green is bullish on the tourism opportunities the spaceport will bring once the commercial space flights begin. New paragraph, if they begin. For now, the spaceport is a futurist tourist attraction, not an operational harbor to the cosmos. So the transition that's going on here is that the author is moving from talking about someone who's really excited about the spaceport bringing commercial space flight. To be bullish on something refers to the stock market, these sort of bull or bear markets. If you're bullish on something, this is like when the stock market is like going up really crazy. And if you're bearish on something, it's the sort of the bear market where the bear is in hibernation. So if the stock market is down, people are losing money, things are not good. You kind of wait it out. So to be bullish on something, this person is excited. But then our author wants to switch gears and talk about a situation in which basically our author wants to switch between people that are bullish and people that are bearish. And they use begin as the word that hooks that transition. So they can transition from talking about people that are excited about spaceports to the people that are like, I don't really think this is going to be a big thing. It's not practical. It's not feasible. There's no future in sight for it. And we've done a nice way of keeping a separation, changing these paragraphs and having those paragraph breaks in there, but using particular words that can keep the thread going and keep them tight so that people don't lose their interest or their engagement. They can kind of keep reading. So I can share this presentation with all of you. There's some links throughout that have some of these resources. So lastly, there are these two more here. The MIT Communications Lab and the website called the Open Notebook are two great general science communication resources that I would recommend to everyone. And I also do want to recommend the MSWI like science writing guide that you all have. It's a great like shorthand guide, I think, for students. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with that, but I did also just want to point that out, that I think that's a great resource along with these two that I've sort of linked here. So that's what I have. And I think we have about 10 minutes left or so. So if people have questions or just discussions, whether it's about things I've said in this presentation or just questions more generally about the Writing Center, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Kyle. Does anybody have any questions here?
I have one question.
Yes.
I'm just wondering more so in terms of like balancing professionalism with creativity and being able to kind of achieve all of these things with like capturing your audience and like using these techniques. Sometimes it feels like maybe a more creative piece would achieve that. But a lot of the scientific writing that I'm familiar with might, tend towards more professional scopes. And I'm wondering how you balance that. Any advice for that?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is going to depend on the outlet. So if you are writing for an outlet that has a certain degree of like professionalism, or maybe you kind of feel like it's kind of like a little stale or stuffy, it's kind of hard to do much about that simply because a lot of that is created by the editorial board of the outlet. So you're kind of like at you might submit a piece to them that is a little bit more creative or informal, and they might like it and they might accept it. And then that email that you're going to get right when they accept it is, here's how we want you to change it to fit the tone of our magazine. And that just might be you. There's not a lot you can do if you want it published there. You're kind of at the whims of the editors. And to be honest, the areas in which I see more creative science, honestly, just science communication broadly happening, is science communicators kind of like doing their own thing in a certain sense. So whether that is starting a Substack, or whether that is starting a YouTube channel, or blogging in some way, or even being on like just doing TikTok, like all of these kinds of different things, they've created an avenue for science communication that is a little bit more creative and less formal in the sort of traditional sense. And my hope is that the success in those fields can sort of filter back into some of the more traditional magazines in ways that they'll be open to a little bit more of it. But I do think it's tough, and I actually think that that's one of the reasons why that the sort of independent publishing route has kind of taken off online, because I think people find that being a little bit more creative is fun and also a little bit more engaging to their audiences. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the questions I had was, you had mentioned that a lot of the times what people are doing now is looking for like creative cool ways to plug in for certain words, especially going through like ChatGPT and everything. How do you, I guess like as a writer yourself, how do you like, what advice would you give to young people who now have such easy access to ChatGPT, and how would they like navigate it? Because it is a tool that people kind of use sometimes arbitrarily, I feel like, or without thinking too much about it. So how would you yeah, what advice would you give in that context?
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess if you're a writer, my assumption is that you want to write. And so if you're like I think if you're relying heavily on ChatGPT to produce written content, I mean, I would maybe just like ask yourself like why are you doing it, right? And I think for some people it's sort of like an idea generator, and from there people can kind of like go and do their own thing. And I'm not like here to say that there's like necessarily like right or wrong ways to use it. I mean, obviously if you're just cutting and pasting directly without some type of attribution, like that's plagiarism. And so that's not good. Obviously, like I think in the context of class or school, we kind of get into this feeling like, oh, I have to write for school. Writing is the medium through which I submit assignments and I get my grades. And when I get my grades, I get my diploma, and then I get my diploma and I get my job. And like writing becomes this process through which it's like the medium to like get this other thing that we want. And I think for all of you here, like you're maybe interested in writing as like a means to do something else, right? It's not just this, like you're actually trying to use writing to communicate a particular idea to an audience. And I think that the writing process itself is, I think, like what I say to my students at least is like, sometimes we get caught up in thinking that writing is just the medium through which we communicate our ideas. And we have this mental model in our head that the way things work is that we just think about stuff really hard and then it comes out on paper. And that the paper is just the reflection of the thought that's already been done in our brains. But writing is itself a form of production. And what I mean by that is that writing is thought itself. Writing is not the thing that happens after thought. Writing is also an integral process of thought. So that when you write, you also think. And you think and understand in ways that you couldn't do without having written. So the degree to which we use substitutes for that process is an opportunity to kind of miss out on the really productive and like sort of thought developing aspects of writing as a practice. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't other unique benefits that using like large language models or ChatGPT, like they can also expand our thought in certain ways. I'm not like trying to paint a picture where it's like we're all just like getting stupider or something like that. It's not this kind of like boomer doomer situation. Like I'm really just trying to say that there's a unique aspect that we miss and we might gain it somewhere else, but we have to sort of understand that there's a trade-off here, that there's something that we're missing when we use that as a substitute.
Thank you so much. Is there any
I've
more
just
questions?
another question here that someone sent. Just in terms of writing strategy. So when you're facing writer's block, and let's say, you're not as motivated, I guess you spoke about, a lot of us here might be actually enjoy writing, but also have assignments to submit, and writing becomes also a task at the same time. Is there like some strategies that you've seen or you've suggested to students that have been helpful in terms of kind of like overcoming the writing block?
Yeah. One thing that I didn't touch on in this presentation, but I'm a big fan of is like is outlining. And I think in my experience, and people experience writing block really differently. But just speaking for things that have been effective for me and have been effective for my students is like we can kind of get this like anxiety over a blank page. And I think that that's where the impulse is to be like, okay, let me just Google or ChatGPT or like something to put words on the page. And then once I have that structure, I can kind of dive into it and figure out where I want to go and like do my thing. And I think it's, that just finding a type of outlining or drafting strategy that you like. And there's several that I could give some examples of. But I think it's kind of personal, right? Like the way that our brains relate to writing is pretty varied. And so we just need to find like an outlining strategy that works for us and commit to it. And what I mean by this is like, even if you don't want to, and even if you think it's a waste of time, and even if you don't use it, outlining for me is like my number one tip. I think that we have this assumption that, oh, like my assignments due really soon. There's lots of pressure. I have competing interests. I have competing duties. I have to go to class. I have my job. I just need to write the thing. I can't waste my time doing like an outline or like a brainstorming session, or I can't just like write down random thoughts on a piece of paper because it's not efficient. And I think that uh, if we can sort of separate ourselves from considering it as like an efficiency thing, but more of a strategy of being like, look, I'm just going to write all of this down. I'm going to write my thoughts. I also really recommend a pen and paper for this. Like for me, in the brainstorming, outlining area of my work, like when I'm at that stage for a writing assignment, um, just a pen and paper where I can like draw, I can make arrows really easily, something that's kind of like low technology. it's helpful for me. Do an outline, and then from there, it might give me some ideas to write down, and then I just kind of like fill in the outline. Sometimes I don't use the outline at all, but just the forcing myself to do the outline is usually like a nice first step in getting me going.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Um, I don't think I see any more questions here, but if you do, maybe you can either email Kyle up there on the
Yes.
email, or
Yeah.
also you also have access to our Instagram, which I will put in here. Um,
Um, yeah,
our
just I wanted to say that, if there are any, if you have any questions about this presentation, or even if you just have your own sort of like personal writing questions, you can write to me. I'm happy to help out with those as best as I can.
Yeah. And for those that joined late, in the beginning, I also posted the links to the McGill Writing Center Instagram as well as their website. So I'm going to post it again and you can access that here. And of course, we always record and have this. We'll be putting this on our website as well. So thank you so much, Kyle. We really appreciate you taking the time to present and work with us.
Yeah. Thanks again for having me. It was a good time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye everyone.